Hi, my name is Brian Atkins, and sometimes I get so into something that it borders on obsessive, and today I'm obsessed with controllers. The Nintendo Switch is the latest Nintendo console/handheld that came out in early 2017 and took the world by storm, becoming one of the highest selling Nintendo thingies since the Wii/DS, depending if you count it as a console or handheld. With launch titles such as Zelda, it became an instant success. But what kind of controller will you use to play your games? The Nintendo Switch, being a Nintendo console, has a weird controller system to start with. We call this one the Joy-Cons, and it looks like this. Each Joy-Con comes in either a left or a right variety, and can come in an assortment of colors like gray or red and blue, or even ones I don't have. The Joy-Con system is sort of like having two halves of one controller, which makes sense considering their primary focus is to split in half and attach to each side of the Nintendo Switch, sort of like bread on a sandwich. Let's talk about the Joy-Cons. Each one is pretty similar on their own, but each has a special feature that makes them unique. The left Joy-Con has the ability to be held in the left hand with an analog stick and 4 buttons that mimic a traditional D-pad. The right one has the 4 face buttons, an analog stick that doubles as amiibo functionality, and an IR sensor built into the bottom. The right Joy-Con has so many more features than the left one that it makes no sense to me that when they were sold separately they were the same price. The Joy-Cons each have 2 main shoulder buttons, as well as 2 hidden shoulder buttons. The reason the Joy-Cons are designed like this is so you can hold them sideways and use them like smaller controllers, allowing for instant multiplayer action. Horrible multiplayer action where the player holding the right Joy-Con is at a disadvantage, especially if they have big yaoi hands like I do. My thumbs are constantly rubbing into each other and it's awful. The console comes with 2 bonus straps that you can attach to the Joy-Cons to add some bulk to them, making those hidden shoulder buttons a little easier to press and adding a wrist strap so you don't lose them. The motion controls for the Joy-Cons are similar to the motion controls for the Wii. There are certain games that encourage its use, like ARMS or Clubhouse Games, bowling. It's similar to Wii Sports Bowling, but more complicated and makes less sense. That's because the Wii remotes used a sensor bar to measure distance and position, and the Joy-Cons just come in blind. There's also added peripherals like the Nintendo Labo that you can build with cardboard, but they're even more sensitive to water than the electronic parts, and I ended up throwing them away. I still have the game, but now it's pretty pointless unless I want to lick it. Did you know Nintendo Switch game cartridges have a bittering agent added to them? This is to keep kids from eating them, but to me it just tastes good, so sometimes I lick it. Anyway, the Joy-Cons have an added bonus feature no one really talks about, and I call it Twin Op. Some games are single player, some are multiplayer or co-op, where multiple people each have their own controller, and then the Switch can have games that are Twin Op, which is where it's a single player game, but one person holds the left Joy-Con and one person holds the right Joy-Con. This could vary from game to game, but a really fun thing to do while drinking is to try to play Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild this way. Horrible experience, 10 out of 10 would recommend. Well, let's say you don't like Joy-Cons. That's alright, there's a lot of options for modding them. First off, you might be like me, and just like buttons. Sometimes I think controllers aren't good enough because they don't have enough buttons, and with the Joy-Cons, there are always a few buttons that end up hidden when you use them as a regular controller. So let's say we ditch the normal connector piece and replace it with a fully functional USB keyboard. The keyboard doesn't have a whole lot of games that support it, but one of the main ones is Animal Crossing New Horizons, where the normal typing method for multiplayer is completely garbage. The keyboard makes it way easier to say things like, "Where is red?" and "turnip prices?" before leaving your friend's town again in like 2 minutes. My main complaint about the keyboard is how light and flimsy it is. This is a problem with a lot of controllers I have, and I came up with a great solution. I glued a bunch of pennies into it. Now it feels heavier, and in my mind at least, feels like a higher end piece of technology. Seriously, gluing pennies and shit is great, and I can't recommend it enough. Okay, but let's talk about those buttons on the left Joy-Con. Nintendo has had D-pads on their systems ever since their NES back in the 80s. They patented the design, which is why the PlayStation and Xbox didn't have one for so long. And now that the patent has basically expired, they seem to have given up on it. The lack of a D-pad has been one of the biggest complaints about the system, and has a lot of fixes available. One of the most drastic fixes was by Nintendo themselves, in the form of the Nintendo Switch Lite, which was one of the best names I've ever heard. Thanks, Nintendo! Anyway, that one has a D-pad, but it can't be docked or played on a TV. Another fix was by Hori with their left Joy-Cons for sale that have D-pads built in, but they lack almost every other function the Joy-Con had. It can only be used while connected to the Switch itself, making it a cheaper way to basically have a Switch Lite. But what if I want to connect it to my keyboard and penny thing? Well, a company called Bastop is making bank on Amazon by selling these replacement shells for the Joy-Cons and Switch itself. I would never replace the shell on the Switch itself because I'm an alcoholic and don't want to have to buy a new Switch. However, replacing the shells on one Joy-Con is fine. Plus, bonus, it's translucent purple, just like my childhood. Yay! Okay, so quick side note, instead of a start button, the Switch has a plus button, right? So in Luigi's Mansion 3, when I was playing it, EGAD says to press the plus button, and my dumbass is like, but I am pressing the D-pad, because I'm dumb. Moving on. So Joy-Cons, yeah? But what if no? Okay, so first off, you can use the GameCube controller. This is important for games like Smash Bros. Because the GameCube controllers have that familiar click-clack to them. The GameCube adapter for the Wii U works for the Switch to give it access to the GameCube controllers. I glued mine into my shelf unit because I like to glue things to other things. It also doubles as a bed for my phone when it's charging. So GameCube controllers have some positive and negative effects when it comes to Switch games. When it works well. The GameCube controller has almost all the right amount of buttons. The rumble works, it's great for Smash, but I usually use it for Kirby Star Allies. Kirby games basically just use the A and B buttons and the analog stick anyway, so it's fantastic. I was really hoping it would work well for Animal Crossing, but that's when we get into the downsides. There's a start button, but no minus button, no home button, no ZL button. In Animal Crossing New Horizons, the ZL button is constantly used for the Nook phone thing. The GameCube controller is basically incompatible. I thought I could just go into the controller setting app on the Switch and change ZL to be a different button on the GameCube controller, but for some reason it won't let me reassign buttons on the GameCube controller. Oh well, let's look at other options. So 8BitDo makes all these Bluetooth controllers that can connect to the Switch. My favorite is the SN30 Pro, because it looks and feels like the SNES controller, with the button layout. But has analog sticks and rumble and all that. It doesn't have amiibo support, but like honestly, who uses those? The SN30 Pro works perfectly for 2D platformers like New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe because it has a big chunky D-pad. I love it, but I'm also a fickle bitch, so let's look at something more complicated. The 8BitDo adapter can plug into the Switch and allow you to connect any Bluetooth controller to it at all. Quick side note, you can use this to connect the SN30 Pro controller and allow you to add a turbo button function, which makes certain games tremendously easier. Collecting star fragments in Animal Crossing has never been the same. But let's talk about something else for a second. You can connect a PS3 controller and Xbox One controller, basically anything. I chose a Wii Remote. The Wii Remote has the slot on the bottom of it that was used for the Wii Nunchuck as well as the Wii Classic controller. By connecting the Wii Remote to the Switch with the 8BitDo adapter, I can now use the Wii Classic controller to play Super Mario Odyssey, which was a life goal I've had for almost 5 minutes now, and I'm so happy I could accomplish it. Now, a super fun thing you can do is if you have the NES and SNES Classic consoles, those little mini ones, you can plug those controllers into the bottom of a Wii Remote. So now you can use the NES controller to play NES Switch Online games, and the SNES controller to play the SNES Switch Online games. It's not perfect, there's no home button, and the NES controller doesn't have the shoulder buttons to access the menu, but hey, I already have them, so it's better than ordering the more expensive Bluetooth ones off of Nintendo's website. But okay, so here's the thing with the Wii that not a lot of people realize, and this thing is adapters? When the Wii was announced, they had an image to demonstrate the Virtual Console. It showed a Wii Remote and every other Nintendo controller underneath it with the wires leading up to it. This was initially a way to show that the console's Virtual Console could play all of the older games, but companies like RAFnet have created adapters that actually allow you to plug those older controllers into the Wii Remote. You can actually find tutorials online for how to build that adapter directly into the N64 controller in case you wanted to do that. I guess this could mean you could play Mario Odyssey or Breath of the Wild with an N64 controller like a real 90s kid. But that's not what I'm about. I don't know what company I bought this thing from, but I guess Mayflash also makes them? This thing allows you to plug a PlayStation DualShock controller into a Wii Remote. So here's something, the PlayStation DualShock controller has the same amount of buttons as the Joy-Con controller, 2 shoulder buttons, a better D-pad. Now I realize I could easily just use the PS3 controller instead of a PS1 or PS2 controller, but that's the fun part about being into fringe tech. I bought this PS1 controller at a Goodwill for $3 back in 2013, and now I can use it for the Nintendo Switch through a Wii Remote to play games from a variety of systems. Anyway, my name is Brian Atkins, and I'm obsessed with game controllers. Please like and subscribe.